I am delighted today that we are talking about Julian Jaynes' ideas. He's had a profound impact on my thinking, but I've always found it very difficult to communicate his ideas fully to people. So I have got big guns today. We've got Marcel Kuijsten, who is the founder of Julian Jaynes Society. And we also have Brian McVeigh, who actually worked who was a student of Julian Jaynes, and he's been working on anthropology rest of his life. So with that, let me go ahead. It's going to be an interview format. So the format is I'm going to talk to Marcel first about Julian Jaynes and his crucial ideas. Then I'm going to get Brian in to talk about Julian Jaynes and further expand on it. Then we will do Q&A. So let's get started. So Marcel, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Wonderful. So Marcel, how did you come across Julian Jaynes? What is your background and how did you come across Julian Jaynes?
I read a book review of Julian Jaynes's book when I was way back when I was a psychology undergraduate student. And I read the book and was really impressed and enthusiastic about it. And Jaynes was covering so much territory that I was already really fascinated by, and answering for the first time a lot of questions that I had been really interested in for a long time. And so from there, this was around the time the very beginnings of the internet and in terms of popular use. And I decided to post I wrote an essay on the book for a psychology class, and I posted it online. And I was very surprised to start receiving emails from all around the world that were enthusiastic readers of the book, and they wanted for the first time to have someone else to communicate with about it. And I thought, wow, I really have hit on something here. And it wasn't long after that Julian Jaynes passed away in 1997, and I was just in the process of planning to reach out to him. I had a sort of a book club with a psychology professor, and we were going chapter by chapter discussing the ideas, and we had made a list of questions, and then I discovered he had just passed away. And so I just started a small website about the theory, and I wanted to create a discussion forum where people could share the ideas. And long story short, that grew into the Julian Jaynes Society, and it led to the publication of the books that we've done about the theory, and it's all just grown from there.
Wonderful. So what is the best way you've communicated Julian Jaynes' ideas to many people? What's the best way to go about communicating these ideas? There are a bunch of people here who have read Julian Jaynes, but there are many people here who are not familiar with Julian Jaynes.
Well, hopefully, we can give a basic, very high-level overview and inspire the people that haven't read Jaynes's book to read it for themselves. And then maybe in the Q&A, we can get into some of the more in-depth things for the people that are familiar with Jaynes and maybe have questions that they'd like to have answered. So just first off, who was Julian Jaynes? He was a psychologist. He got his doctorate from Yale. He taught at Princeton University for more than 25 years on consciousness. Well, he had dedicated his life to the study of consciousness. And in 1977, published his book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. That was immediately very successful and well received. There were also critiques, but a lot of positive reviews. And from there, he went on to lecture frequently on his book and his theory and consciousness, very frequently for many years, almost right up until his death in November of 1997. His ideas on consciousness, I think, were very far ahead of their time, especially at that time. Consciousness was still seen as a a topic that was almost a little bit of a taboo academically, that it couldn't be studied, you couldn't make progress in this area. That's begun to change, but a lot of the ideas about consciousness that you see out there now still are confusing a lot of different mental functions and lumping them all under this big umbrella of consciousness. And what Jaynes was able to do was start by giving a really precise definition of what he was talking about. And I think the first thing to do is explain that definition, because if one doesn't understand Jaynes's more precise definition of consciousness, the rest of the theory really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Perfect. So what is consciousness, according to
So,
Julian Jaynes?
the standard view that I think most people have, if they've never thought about the topic, I think we kind of inherited this idea from Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution, that consciousness just came along at some point in evolution when brains reached a certain level of complexity. And so it's biologically based, but there's really very little evidence to support that at all. And this is the main problem in the field of consciousness studies today, is that if you go to a conference on consciousness, people are all talking about the term using very, very different definitions. And they're all kind of talking past each other. And if you look at some of the critiques of Jaynes's theory, and we might get to that later, many are just simply critiquing the theory based on a much broader definition. So we'll try to give a brief overview of what Jaynes was meaning when he talked about consciousness. And so he started by explaining some of the things that consciousness is not, because it kind of strips away all these layers that are typically packaged in. And the first thing is, Jaynes said, consciousness is not all mentality. It's not the sum of all our conscious processes. And one of the main things that falls under that is often lumped in with consciousness is sensory perception. So when people have a sort of knee-jerk objection to Jaynes, they're often thinking of consciousness as though it's like visual perception, that I'm conscious of you by looking at you. And sensory perception is shared with all animals. It's a very basic thing that consciousness is not necessary for. Jaynes is talking more about this inner world that we have, our inner dialogue, our ability to introspect. And he gives an example of asking a flashlight in a dark room to look around and explain what it sees. And the flashlight, everywhere it looks, the room is brightly lit. And so because things outside, processes outside of our consciousness we're not aware of, we have this illusion that consciousness is everything. But it's actually a very, very small part of what goes on in the brain. And that's been demonstrated, experimentally now as well. It's not a copy of experience. This was an early idea by John Locke and others, that consciousness was this putting together of images and memory and things like that. But if we think about a memory of ourselves, maybe swimming or hiking, most people will actually see themselves in the third person, kind of looking down on themselves from a bird's eye view. That's not anything you experienced in consciousness. It's your consciousness constructing that image. So it's not a copy of experience. And then the next thing gets a little more challenging, is that it's actually not necessary for learning. So you can have all types of learning happening outside of conscious awareness. One example is like Pavlovian conditioning, pairing food with a bell with dogs and then having them salivate just to the sound of the bell. That's all happening without consciousness. And then even things like learning skills like typing. It's been shown that most of the improvements happen automatically. It's not something we can really introspect on and have any idea exactly what we're doing. We're just practicing and getting better. He gives another example of taking two coins and tossing them in the air and catching them with opposite hands. And it's almost impossible if you've never done it before at first, but then pretty quickly you're getting a hang of it. And there's nothing you can say about exactly how that happened. It just, you're learning non-consciously. Finally, this really challenges some of our very basic notions of what consciousness is. And it seems like this would be at the heart of consciousness, but Jaynes explains how consciousness is not really necessary for thinking and reasoning. And all of these things are happening outside of our conscious awareness, but we have this illusion that everything is within our consciousness. And a very simple example he gives was an experiment that was done about 100 years ago with holding a weight in each hand and then making a judgment as to which weight is heavier. And that's a form of thinking. And the answer comes instantly. Generally, it's not something that you can introspect on or have any conscious awareness of how you came to the answer. Another example he gives in the book is a series of geometric shapes, say a triangle, a circle, a triangle, a circle. And if you ask someone what's the next shape in the sequence, they instantly know it's a triangle. There's nothing that you can introspect on as to where that answer came from. And many, many other types of processes all happening outside of conscious awareness. But we just have this illusion that that's something we're consciously doing. And finally, on this point, we have people like Albert Einstein and great mathematicians who've all talked about this, how they might be consciously focused on a problem for weeks or even months. And then when they're laying in bed or shaving or going for a walk, suddenly the solution comes to them. So they set up the problem, they studied it for a period of time, and then usually there's this incubation period where the solution is worked out outside of your conscious awareness, so in the non-conscious parts of your mind, and then that solution suddenly comes as an insight to conscious awareness. So those are some of the things that consciousness is not necessary for. So we start to realize that we can have humans earlier in history capable of very complex tasks.
Let me interrupt for a second. I want to make sure that people get this point. So let me, one of the things that we do in this meetup is called syntopical comparison. So let me compare it to, for example, Jung talks about a similar point. He says your self or your psyche is very large, and your ego consciousness is like the spotlight, which is actually operating, focused on a very tiny part of this entire self. And the self is doing a lot. It's actually doing most of the things that you're not aware of. And the consciousness is full of effort. It is self-reflective. It is self-aware. So it is like a spotlight moving around, which is sometimes on and sometimes off as well, in this larger space of the self. Is that similar to what Jaynes says?
That does sound like very similar ideas, and I'm not as familiar with that, but it's a very similar concept.
So let me pursue it in a slightly different way, because I want to make sure that people get this point, because if they get the point of what Jaynes is referring to by consciousness, then like half the battle is won.
Exactly.
So it looks like you talked about the inner world that is created. You talked about introspection. You talked about the inner dialogue. You talked about the spotlight. These are the 4 ways I got from what you said.
So now we're getting to, okay, we've talked about some very complex things that consciousness is not necessary for, and that, just to put a period on that concept, even today, we can get through the majority of our day without consciousness. A lot of our behavior is just purely habitual, and we can get dressed, we can drive to work, and as long as sometimes you might arrive at work and not even remember the trip because you were so immersed in some issue that's occupying your mind. So your consciousness was focused on these thoughts that you're having, and the driving happens automatically, assuming there's no obstacles on the road. So a lot of our daily life, we can actually function quite well without introspection really being necessary. So the simplest way to think about then, well, what is consciousness in the Jaynesian sense? And he would say it's the contents of introspection, that which is introspectable. And another point on this, it's not an on or off proposition. It's not like you're conscious or not conscious. And again, it has nothing to do with being knocked unconscious. I should have mentioned that as well. Jaynes would use the more precise term reactivity. So someone could be reactive, but not conscious. So these features of consciousness he gets into in the book. We can touch on them now, but I encourage people to read more about them. But these features emerge over time.
Okay,
So,
sorry. Let me stop
yeah.
one more time, because I want to make sure that people get this point. Another kind of syntopical idea is Daniel Kahneman's idea of system 1 and system 2.
Right.
The metaphor of elephant and the rider. So you have the elephant, you have the system 1, which is doing most of the things. This is our habitual system. And when we are buttoning the shirts, when you're driving the car, as long as things are in the normal realm, system 1 is doing everything. But then when something else happens which requires your attention and a different course of action, redirection, that's when the system 2 kicks in, which is a much more deliberative, conscious process. Is it a similar idea?
It is highly similar. And for those of you who've read his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you could have titled that book a little more cumbersomely as Thinking Non-Consciously and Consciously. So the thinking fast is the non-conscious cognition, and the thinking slow is what Jaynes is talking about as consciousness. And there's distinctions and finer differences, but in a very broad sense, they're very compatible ideas. And a lot of what Kahneman talks about is evidence, supporting Jaynes's idea that consciousness is this narrow aspect of our mentality.
Perfect. Marcel, this is a huge step because most of us are familiar here with Daniel Kahneman's work. In our New York group, we actually went through Thinking Fast and Slow chapter by chapter. So it's kind of part of our common vocabulary. So I think this is big. So you can just assume that people know the system 1 and system 2.
That's fantastic. And thanks for reminding me of that similarity. I wrote a brief few sentence review of his book, and I point this fact out. So you're right on target there. So there's these different features. We won't get too into them, I think, today, but there are things like spatialization, where without consciousness, it's hard to think of one's life on a timeline with a future extending into the future and a past. And all of these spatial qualities are one of the features of consciousness. He talks about things like the analog eye, and this is this view you have of yourself going around vicariously in your imagination, doing things. You might imagine, how might I have better handled that situation with my boss yesterday, or, role playing out these ideas, or, with athletes who can mentally rehearse their performance. And yeah, we have an athletic trainer here. And so that's the analog eye. And there's the metaphor me, which is sort of this third person view that you have of yourself in consciousness. And these are things that I would encourage people to delve in a little more deeply on their own in the book. A final one is narratization. And, this endless internal dialogue that we have going on in our mind all the time is one of the key features of consciousness. And try to imagine, what that would be like if we didn't have language. So language is this key factor for the development of consciousness. And that's one of the key insights that Jaynes came to. And if we didn't have language as this vehicle to anchor our thoughts to, it would be impossible to have higher forms of thought. And we'd be limited more or less to just impulses. And so when people talk about whether or not certain animals are conscious and this kind of thing, it's really confusing the definition. And so a way to question that or to think about it is an analog eye narratizing in a mind space. So that's sort of a succinct definition that really gets to the heart of what Jaynes is talking about. Does that person, for example, a non-linguistic person, would likely not have an analog eye narratizing in a mind space? That's the heart of Jaynes's very precise but important definition, because if you don't have this important, very precise definition, then you can't unravel what we'll get into next. But there's some pretty good evidence from people like Helen Keller and others that before language acquisition, there is not this Jaynesian consciousness. And this is often a shock to people that, an infant is not conscious in the Jaynesian sense. But the more one understands the way he's talking about the term, the more this starts to make sense.
Let us spend some time on this, because if people get this idea of creating inner space here, I think we'll get that. So maybe Brian, if you could talk about that, and then I will talk about how I understand it. So how do you understand this specialization, Brian?
Well, the place I would start to make the argument more convincing is that if you look at languages before about 1000 BCE, it's very difficult to find expressions or terms that refer to what we would call spatialization and other features of consciousness. Spatialization, I think another way to talk about that most people pick up on immediately is mental imagery, not imagination. Sometimes people use these words interchangeably. But when I say mental imagery, I'm talking about something quite specific. Of course, the idea that there's some space in your head where you can visualize what you had for breakfast. And if you're confronted with a problem or something is bothering you, not all the time, it depends, of course. Many of us will have an image in our head. And recently there was a good study on what they call aphantasia, where there are some people actually who do not have images. So it's an interesting question for me, to what degree is mental imagery learned? And if you take a Jaynesian perspective, I think that it is something that's learned, but for whatever reason, some people don't pick up on mental imagery. They'll pick up on other features of consciousness, but not necessarily mental imagery. But in any case, I don't want to get far down in the weeds. But spatialization is really, I think Jaynes actually said spatialization is the most primitive aspect of consciousness. And Marcel already talked about several features of consciousness. And for those of you who are interested, you can go to Jaynes, his book, and I think it's maybe pages 58 to 64 or something like that, where he lists these very specific features. He lists about 6 or 7 of them. And as I said, I think I'm pretty sure he starts off with spatialization, because the idea is that if you can build something, if you can believe that there's a space in your head, then other features of consciousness follow.
No, I think this is a huge idea for folks. So if you get this idea, you get a lot of what, because that's like the foundation of how Jaynes thinks about consciousness. It's a way of kind of simulating possibilities in your head instead of simply reacting. When you're operating with system, when you're simply reacting, there's something that happens and you do something. So there is nothing in the middle. What you're doing is that you're actually creating a space where you're considering the possibilities. You're playing out yourself as a person saying, I could do this or I could do that. And that is the beginning of self-awareness, self-consciousness, being able to say, you know, I have this ability of choosing between this and this. What would happen if I do this? So it brings in a level of mental operation, deliberate mental operation, self-aware mental operation, which takes a giant leap forward. That's what he's talking about. Go ahead, Marcel.
Yeah, I think that's another important point that you're raising, is that for Jaynes, non-human animals are entirely stimulus response. And through the development of consciousness, the learning of consciousness through metaphorical language, we have developed this space between stimulus and response where we can deliberate our actions and choose our behaviors. And in ancient history, people had not yet, according to Jaynes, developed this space between stimulus and response. And from here, we can talk about how Jaynes started to look for this in ancient history. Okay, so after studying consciousness or trying to study consciousness in animals for years, Jaynes hit on this idea that language was a necessary prerequisite, and others like Daniel Dennett also are proponents of this idea called the language dependency hypothesis. And so he started to look back through history to see if there were changes. And around 3000 BC is when we have the first writing, cuneiform in Mesopotamia and hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. But one of the oldest documents that's of reliable translation and long enough to analyze is the Iliad. And what shockingly Jaynes discovered was, if you look at the older parts of the Iliad, as it has had newer layers and additions more recently, there is no introspection, and it's very action oriented. And when Achilles, for example, has to make a decision, rather than deliberating on it or introspecting, a goddess appears and issues a command and tells him what to do. Well, this was always seen as a literary device or just part of the story, but Jaynes felt this was a misinterpretation of the Iliad that was not composed by a man named Homer as modern poetry would be composed, but it was transmitted through generations by Greek bards that were in almost a trance state. And he felt that this was a realistic depiction of their psychological experience, that they were hearing these voices that were directing their behavior. And then when he started to look in other places, he found similar evidence for this throughout the ancient world. And so what Achilles was hearing was what we today would call an auditory hallucination. And Jaynes believes that the auditory hallucinations that are experienced by so many people still today, many more people than was initially believed, are a holdover from this mentality that predated consciousness. So the idea is, if consciousness is much more recent in history than we presumed, and if it's a learned process, culturally based process that came about at a certain point when language developed a certain level of complexity, well, then what was the psychological functioning prior to that? What was the mentality? He called this the bicameral mind, and it was something that developed along with language in ancient history, and it was the brain using language as a tool to transmit experience as efficiently as possible from one brain hemisphere to the other. And he speculated that the neurology of this would be that language is processed for most people, right-handed people, in the left temporal lobe. Those are the language areas. So what were the language areas of the non-dominant right hemisphere doing? Well, he speculated that they were becoming active when this person would hear a voice giving them direction, transmitting experience. But the technology wasn't available at that time to really test it. Since then, starting in 1999, technology progressed to the point where they could do brain imaging of people during hallucinations. And it turned out it was exactly as Jaynes predicted, that most of us suppress these language areas in our non-dominant hemisphere, but in people that are hallucinating, these language areas become active. And for reasons we don't really completely understand, something about the activity of the language areas in the non-dominant hemisphere gives us this sense that these voices are coming from outside of ourselves, that they're alien to us, and interpreted within the context of one's culture as a chief, a king, a dead ancestor, a god, or for people who hear voices today, it's often interpreted as a political figure or a religious figure or that kind of thing. So that's kind of the explanation of this bicameral mind that Jaynes thinks was operating prior to this development of consciousness based on language.
Wonderful. So I want to approach it from the kind of evolutionary perspective. So I mean, the way I understand this is that there is the concept of God and concept of man, the executive function, directing function, and the doer function. So for example, consider like a primate troop. In the primate troop, it's the alpha male, who is directing everything. And anybody who is not alpha male is just listening. So they are basically really paying attention. If you watch a gorilla troop carefully, especially a gorilla troop. In chimpanzee troop, it becomes a little bit because the size differential is not that much. But in gorilla troop or even chimpanzee troop, the alpha male is directing everything. And all other animals are kind of taking the cue from the alpha male to decide to basically do action. Now, the same thing applied to human beings in a smaller group in the evolutionary concept when we lived in a tribe of maybe 30 people. But when we went to a city and you still had to operate like that, basically there was a concept of a king, a god king, if you will, where people just said, look, I'm not going to figure out how I need to live. I will just obey this god king. And it's that kind of evolution, that kind of historical base, and the voice of the god king would be what they would be listening to. So that's kind of the parallel kind of in the existential. Does that make sense?
That's exactly right. It's this idea that as group size, around 10,000 BC, we have the emergence of civilization, and tribes were settling down in the beginnings of agriculture. And there needed to be a mechanism to keep people focused beyond the sight of this alpha male leader that normally would have been just a group of 35 or 40 people that were always within sight of each other. So that was one of the functions of the bicameral mind, was to keep people focused on a task by hearing the voice of the king or leader. It was a form of social organization, and it was also this way of communicating information between the hemispheres of the individual. And there's a lot of evidence that Jaynes talks about for this. It's a very shocking concept initially for most people, but once he walks you through all of this evidence for the bicameral mind, it seems, I think, impossible to deny that something like this had to have taken place. We can get into a little bit of that here. Some of it was the beginnings of these leaders that were in death, propped up as if they could still hear their voice. There was the feeding of the dead after they were buried, keeping skulls and inside the home, which Jaynes felt was eliciting hallucinations. But he attacks it from so many different angles. There's a whole nother aspect to this, which is, Brian mentioned this, but it's the evolution of mental language. And in the Iliad, we have a number of different words that all referred to things like the heart, the lungs, or nous, which is recognition or holding something in one's visual field. And over time, we see these words morph into meaning consciousness or mind or conscious mind. And the thinking is, if they didn't have the language for consciousness in these earlier times, it probably wasn't part of their experience. And other scholars have looked at this same pattern that Jaynes documents in Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece. And Michael Carr has documented this same type of transition, both the anthropological evidence as well as the literary evidence in ancient China. And Todd Gibson has written about this extensively in Tibet. So we see this same general pattern taking place all over the world, and sometimes at different times. We have, for example, in Mesopotamia, the god is the owner of all the lands and is the ruler. And what we would think of as a king was like a steward to the god. And they took the form of idols, and they fed the idols, they bathed them, they dressed them, they took them out on parades. And all of this is very hard to understand in terms of our modern conscious psychology. And it's been kind of glossed over by historians just documenting these things, but never looking at this with the real awe and fascination of what was really going on here. And then in each person's home was a small idol, and they've unearthed thousands of these in Mesopotamia. And Jaynes believes that was the hallucinatory aid for the person's personal god. So there's a number of different aspects to this. And then as this whole process breaks down, and consciousness begins to emerge, we see another number of historical things taking place that are very interesting, that are really inexplicable, I think, outside of this theory. But I'll let you jump in.
Sure. So imagine yourself living in this civilization where you don't need to take any decisions. You're basically, voices are going to come to you. And this is not that odd. This is how traditional people work. They're just following the culture, following the tradition. It just comes to you as that's what you're supposed to do. And there are words associated with that, because the words make the actions far more complex. It allows for far more complexity of behavior, the language. So you have this going on, okay? And you've lived in these civilizations for centuries and centuries. And suddenly things start to go wrong. Empires start to fall apart. So these gods that were speaking to you, when you listened to them before, when you obeyed them before, it produced good results. Now it has changed. Now it has changed. So there is this beautiful passages. It's like, my God has forsaken me and disappeared. My goddess has failed me and keeps at a distance. The good angel who walked beside me has departed. Okay, or one has no God as he walks along the street. Headache envelopes him like a garment. So this is a people whose entire mooring from the society and the structure that they depended on is gone. Now what happens? So this is the breakdown.
Yeah, exactly right. And the text that you quoted, which is thought to be the basis of the book of Job from Mesopotamia, is the first time in history we see this idea of the gods having departed. Before this, in all of these texts, the gods are right there with us. And a friend of mine had a fun way of putting it. It's like they're your high school football coach. They're right there with you. They're telling you what to do. They're ever present, and you're hearing the voices, and everything is fine. Well, with growing population size, the invasions that were taking place, the different cultures that were intermingling, There was a lot of chaos going on at this period, this Bronze Age collapse, that the system was no longer workable, and metaphorical language was developing the beginnings of this interiority. And we see for the first time, for example, Tukulti-Ninurta, the Assyrian king, kneeling before an empty throne, and all these different sources talking about the departure of the gods. And a number of new types of behaviors are coming into being for the first time in history. We see divination, which is now this quest to come up with more newer ways to figure out what the gods want us to do, because they're no longer speaking to us directly. And omens become a huge thing in Mesopotamian culture. And oracles in ancient Greece were another way for people to try to determine what the will of the gods was. And all these things are new. And the concept of heaven becomes a new invention. This idea that the gods have left, gone to a remote location, and now we need intermediaries to communicate with them called angels. And there were evil gods called demons. And all of these things were coming about for the first time during this transitionary period between the bicameral mind and the development of consciousness.
Wonderful. So what happens next? So how does, when they call out to their gods and the gods don't come back, what do men do?
Well, this brings in this modern conscious mind that we have. We see, for example, in Solon in 600 BC, the first writings that are very similar to what we would consider modern psychology, and this idea of know thyself and introspection. Another source of evidence for all of this that Jaynes looks at is the Old Testament. And he compares the earliest reliably dated books with the oldest or most recent reliably dated books. And a simple comparison that he gives is comparing Amos to Ecclesiastes. And in Amos, you have an illiterate sheep herder that goes into trance states and puts forth all of this, thus saith the Lord, and scribes are writing it down. Whereas 600 years later with Ecclesiastes, you have this wise person talking about spatialized time and a season for all things. And so this is really documenting, the Old Testament is a document of the transition from bicamerality to consciousness. And Rabbi James Cone does a lot of analysis of this in his book, The Minds of the Bible. And he talks about, there's other ways you can look at the Old Testament, where in the beginning, it's like a parable of all this. God walks alongside Adam and Eve in the late afternoon. Then in Deuteronomy, they're telling us that Moses is the last person to see and talk to God face to face. Then we have this age of prophecy, where first everyone hears the voices of the gods, then only certain individuals continue to hear the voices, and then certain individuals in a certain place, like the oracle at Delphi, and then they fall silent altogether. And around the world, we have this concept of modern religion coming in, which is our attempt to interpret the last known communications of the gods and teach those to successive generations. And so after the age of prophecy, we have the age of wisdom. So lots of different sources and ways to look at these things that most of us are familiar with from a completely new perspective.
Yeah, no, this is really fascinating. My favorite example is the distinction between Iliad and Odyssey. So I want to make 2 points. You've touched upon them before, but I want to kind of reiterate them because people will get it through that. Like when you look at characters in Iliad, things happen to them. Like, gods come and make them do different things. And whenever they're explaining what they're doing, they would say, Athena came to me and asked me to do this. So they are seeing themselves as being the doers, being ordered by these executive beings, which are gods. Now, fast forward to Odyssey. Odysseus is a very different character. He's a wily character. He is thinking, he's self-aware. He's saying, what happens if I do this? Should I do this? What is he going to think? He even has not only a space in his head, he also knows that there is space in other people's head. And say, what are they thinking about? What possibilities are they considering? So what should I do based on that? So there is a level of self-awareness and awareness that there is self-awareness in other people. And that is there in the language itself. That's a huge point, huge point. And that's exactly what Jaynes is talking about. As when he talks about consciousness, he's saying Odysseus is conscious.
Exactly. Yeah. He's looking at the Iliad, and he agrees with the scholarship that these came hundreds of years apart. And the Iliad is this very action-oriented, concrete, non-introspective, God-driven world. And the Odyssey is now the world of the beginnings of consciousness, with the beginnings of deceit, which was complex deceit was not possible before. And the gods are have been dramatically weakened in the Odyssey, and they are talking more to each other than they are directing the characters. And we see, importantly, a change in the frequency and the meaning of these Greek words that we discussed before, where they've now taken on their more modern definitions of conscious mind and not just lungs and vision. So this is another excellent way to compare and contrast these two different psychologies.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm such a big fan of Julian Jaynes is that he's full of insights. So this book, I mean, he goes between kind of evolution and early civilizations to modern civilization. He looks at the nature of language. He looks at how social systems transform the way in which people think. And he just does that while talking about all kinds of things. For example, one of his brilliant observations is how language developed, or how did terms for consciousness develop. So initially we were talking about, thumos, you're talking about like blood rising, right? So when you are getting ready to do something, your blood, heart starts pumping, you start doing, and that word kind of slowly transforms into things like courage. Now, courage, it's kind of initial use of it is mostly about blood rising. And then slowly it kind of it is built on that, and then it becomes a metaphor. And the word courage, as we use now, refers to something in consciousness. So there is this transmission, there is a history of words that he traces to show that.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see these same transitions taking place in completely different cultures, like China, that hadn't been studied at the time of Jaynes's book. And I think anything like this, when you first hear it, it sounds really difficult to wrap one's mind around. And there's a natural inclination of skepticism that I think, is good. But that's, sort of with any new idea. It's one of those things that you have to really immerse yourself in for a while to start thinking about these ideas in a way that's so different from the history that we're used to thinking about, and thinking about consciousness the way that we might have thought about it previously. And one of the things, if we have time, that I always like to touch on, because I think it helps address some of the skepticism, is some of the new evidence for Jaynes's theory that has come along in the last 40 years since he first published his book.
Sure, let's do the neuroscience.
Okay. Yeah. So So this was really exciting, and I think it's something that got a lot of people reinterested in Jaynes who had read his book, like some of the people with us tonight when it first came out. And so that started in 1999 with Belinda Lennox in the UK doing this study of a hallucinating schizophrenic in an MRI machine, pressing a joystick when a hallucination would begin, and then doing a scan of his brain. And indeed, what they found was exactly what Jaynes predicted, was this right-left temporal lobe interaction from the non-dominant language areas, initiating the hallucination, traveling across the corpus callosum, and being heard or perceived in our dominant left hemisphere language areas. This was followed up by many, many other researchers. Iris Sommer in the Netherlands has done a lot of research on the neurology of hallucinations and has quoted Jaynes in her papers, and Renard Jardy in France, and many, many others, dozens and dozens of studies now over the last 20 years, in my view, have really vindicated what is called Jaynes's neurological model for the bicameral mind. So people today are experiencing auditory hallucinations, and it's based on this right-left temporal lobe interaction. And the thinking is that prior to consciousness, the brain hemispheres operated more independently than they do today. Through consciousness, our brain hemispheres operate in a more integrated fashion. And something that also gets to this, which is something some of the people with us are probably already familiar with, is all of the research that was done with split brain patients. And before medications advanced to the point that they are today, an early treatment for severe epilepsy was to sever the connection between the two hemispheres. And with sophisticated lab equipment, what emerged was very shocking. And the two hemispheres seem to be operating very independently and having their own preferences and own ideas about things. And for reasons that are not that clear, our sense of self is wrapped up with our dominant language hemisphere. So when you give a message to the non-dominant, now disconnected right hemisphere, it's not in the awareness of the dominant hemisphere. And maybe this is getting a little too complicated, but it was more neurological evidence that showed this independent operation of the brain hemispheres that gives more evidence for Jaynes's bicameral mind. And you also have people who at a very young age have a hemisphere completely removed due to damage or disease. And we can see that people can operate shockingly with only one brain hemisphere. Is there something you want to?
Yes, there are two questions I have, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. The first one is about writing. So this is a question for both Marcel and Brian. What does Jaynes think is the role of writing in the development of consciousness?
Brian, why don't you start? Because I've been doing a lot of the talking.
Okay. Well, one interesting thing that Jaynes says about writing is that he seems to think that when people started to use writing, when they would read it, the word read would be read, the writing actually spoke to them. And not just in Mesopotamian with cuneiform, but also hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. What's important as a caveat to keep in mind about writing, of course, is that, we're talking thousands of years ago. So probably most people could not read or understand writing. It was probably just a very small elite. But it was that elite, of course, who came up with what today we call mythologies, who controlled information flow. And that's always important to keep in mind, because when we, many times in modern times, when we say writing, we assume that it's a skill, a capability that's universal. And in fact, even now it's not universal, but certainly 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, it was not universal. But in any case, what's important, another important point for Jaynes when it comes to writing, is that writing actually started to erode the voices, because writing was something that was spatialized, it was put out, and was something you could turn away from. And that probably weakened the authorization of the gods' voices. So in any case, that's those are just a couple of points I would start with.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Brian.
I
Marcel, would
think,
you like to add anything?
yeah, I would just say I think that's right. That with the auditory hallucinations, there you can't escape them. If you talk to people who hear voices, it's all encompassing generally, and it's not something you can turn away from. Whereas with writing, you can. It's in a fixed location, and it starts to weaken the authority versus this very immediate sensory experience. And if I could just get one last item in before questions,
Sure.
that I think is really interesting to think about. It's all of this new evidence for auditory hallucinations in modern society, because when Jaynes's book came out, we have to remember this was kind of a fringe topic that hadn't really been looked at for about 100 years prior, because psychology was focused on behaviorism and operant conditioning and those kind of things. And Jaynes inspired this modern interest in auditory hallucinations to a large degree. And studies began being done looking at the incidence of hallucinations in normal people. And lo and behold, many, many more people experience hallucinations than was ever known before. We're talking about everyday average people who don't have any type of medical diagnosis. They've never sought treatment. And I've had a lot of people come to me with their stories because they're not going to share it with the average person because they feel like it's something that's stigmatized in our society. But we now have, this has been studied extensively. Hallucinations occur on a spectrum throughout society. They're found very frequently in high altitude climbers, people under stress, people in military combat situations, people in social deprivation, isolation like solitary confinement, even just sleep deprivation. So if you want to have this experience, you can just stay up for a couple of days, and I can almost guarantee you it will start to happen. Another important thing that we know a lot more about now is the imaginary playmates, or we call it now imaginary companions in children, which are now thought to involve actual hallucinations. And in the ancient world, this imaginary companion would have grown up with the person and become their personal god. There's no other explanation for this other than Jaynes's theory that has any real viability, in my view. The fact that in schizophrenia, I did touch on this earlier, the hallucinations often take the form of a command, fits perfectly with what Jaynes was teaching us. And even in those everyday people that aren't having these command hallucinations that these people often obey, the voices are not random. They are very often centered on behavior, commenting on the person's behavior, criticizing their behavior, or giving them behavioral suggestions. So again, all of this fits perfectly with the bicameral mind theory. There's been no alternate explanations for any of this other than just, yeah, some people hallucinate and we're just going to try to prescribe something, but we can't really tell you why. And there's a huge disconnect between modern psychiatry and mental illness treatment and history, and looking at, we have this point in history where hallucinations went from being visions and spiritual communication, and in the Middle Ages, people were trying to go through fasting and self-injurious behavior to try to elicit the hallucinations, to suddenly there's a transition that takes place where it's now mental illness, and people that would have been a prophet 1,000 years ago are now directed to a psychiatrist. So it's a fascinating thing to think about, and really there's no other good way, I think, of explaining this outside of the context of the bicameral mind theory. And I just wanted to get that in.
Sure. Last question for Brian. Brian, it's very rare to have the opportunity of working with a person of this caliber like Julian Jaynes. So what was it like?
Well, I've actually written a little bit about this, and if I had to describe in one word Julian Jaynes' personality, it would be humble. And I remember him saying to me once that if you're going to be a good researcher, a good scholar, or just an open-minded person, you need to be willing to be wrong. And that was something that I took from him. And this idea of just being open-minded and not worrying too much what other people might think about your ideas, as crazy as they might sound. So he was, yeah, as I said, humility is the word that comes to mind. He was always willing to listen to other people, friendly, a little on the quiet side, sort of very introspective, not surprisingly, but he certainly inspired me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Folks, now we'll go to takeaways. I want to address one point in the chat that Paul and Judith made about the transition between the bicameral to the conscious stage. I mean, one way to think of it very simply is system 1 and system 2. The bicameral people are mostly driven by system 1. You know, they hear something and they do something. It's just reactive. It's reactive to the totality of their culture, and they are hearing it through as voices, but even forget about the thing that they are hearing it. It's a reactive kind of an operation. Conscious operation has system 2 in the middle, where you can hear voices. Your right brain still operates, you know, it's still the same right brain, except that you now have the capacity, you have this mental space where you can, you know, David was talking about competing voices. You have a choice, you have a way of considering multiple things and choosing between them. So you have that awareness. And Paul was pointing out, well, some people don't use it. Yeah, of course, consciousness requires tremendous effort, and you can always fall back upon your system 1 anytime, and that is always available to you. So that's my kind of quick response to the comments in the chat. But I want to now open it up for takeaways. Anybody who wants to say, what are you walking away with? Paul.
Yeah, thank you. And that's good segue because you mentioned my comment. So I'm walking away with a lot of interesting points and questions, which I always do from these, but I'm wholly unconvinced that there couldn't have been these bards telling these stories thousands of years ago, and people could have been introspecting on them in a system 2-like fashion. And the words that were coming from that bicameral other mind were synthesizing metaphorical thoughts as the voice of gods. And I'm wholly unconvinced that introspection wasn't going on then. But I'm very interested, and thank you all.
So what I suggest is that it's actually a very difficult proposition, what Jaynes is doing. Yeah. He's doing something called psychological anthropology, if I want to call it that. That's what he's doing. Nobody does that. But so you're trying to kind of use anthropological evidence, archaeological evidence, in order to figure out what was going on in psychology of a people far back there. So so I would strongly, Paul, I think you would love the book. Okay. Read the book. The richness of his observations is tremendous. And you will get at least 100 points out of it, out of which we were able to probably cover about 12 today. Okay, that also not. Yeah, go ahead.
It's almost impossible to articulate this in a completely convincing manner in a short frame of time. And it goes so far against so many ideas that we've had our whole lives. And it's only by reading the book oneself and really thinking through all of his arguments that I would expect any of this to be convincing. So I completely relate to what you're saying. And I would encourage everyone just to read the book if it sounds interesting. And it's only then that I think some of these ideas are really going to resonate.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that the sheer richness of his work. I mean, the number of observations. See, he's taking on a field which was not actually addressed before. Say, okay, how did consciousness develop? What is the function of language? So for example, we talked about language very briefly, but what he's saying is that initially language was a device for a larger social system to exist by making possible commands which were complex enough. But when that system fell, that same system of language, people started to learn how to use it to consider things inside their own head, creating this space so that they became self-aware, self-directing, self-regulating. And that's the middle term is the language. So it is a profound point about the language and the power of language and how it operates in the brain and what it does to your brain. So that's just one of the things. So it's full of those points. All right. So next up is going to be Joe, Linda, Scott, and Alicia. Joe.
Yeah, so what I'm walking away with is that what consciousness isn't. That's the most important thing that it really started to crystallize a lot of things that, you know, when I think about consciousness, I have so many questions that really helped a great deal for me. Also, the relationship between System 1 and System 2 with Daniel Kahneman was very, very informative. One of the things I just wanted to clarify maybe is the language dependency hypothesis is that if I just look up Dennett, I should be able to find something on that.
Well, if you Google that phrase, you'll find a lot. Daniel Dennett and Peter Carruthers and someone named Philip Zalazzo has done some really interesting work with children and looking at these ideas through the lens of child development and doing some pretty interesting work that supports these ideas that as children acquire language, they learn Jaynesian consciousness. And so that's Philip Zalazzo. But yeah, it's this whole idea that's gained a lot of popularity that we learn consciousness in childhood and teach it to each successive generation.
Thank you. And then the last part is creating space was huge for me as well.
Yeah, no, that is a huge point. It's like, you know, just kind of imagining, it's like there is a space where you can consider possibilities and you can play around. It's like a simulation chamber. It's basically what fighter pilots use to train themselves. They can work things in simulator so that when they are actually doing things, they are far more effective. That's what we can do with our brains when we create space.
Yeah, that was an amazing description of it, and it really kind of opened my eyes up to that as well. And then thinking about that even within the context of System 1 and System 2 and creating space, that kind of puts the whole three like kind of trifecta together for me. So thank you very, very much.
Joe, thanks. That was great. Linda, what are you walking away with?
This is a very interesting way of looking at auditory hallucinations. And to carry it a step further, though, I'm wondering, since you're saying, and it does happen under extreme stress, people will perhaps have auditory hallucinations who would not normally. I'm wondering if these two, the bicameral and consciousness, these changes aren't happening because of chemical changes, that there will be more of the shift to the bicameral mind because under stress, there's a different body chemistry. So the different body chemistry is what really makes it shift over into the bicameral. And do you know of any studies that have looked at the chemistry specifically?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think there is a large literature on that, you know, within schizophrenia research, looking at hormonal factors and adrenaline and these different types of things. But I can't add a lot to that other than this. I think that's correct.
Wonderful. Scott, what are you walking away with?
Actually, some fond memories. I read the book literally like 30 years ago. It's brown because it's so old. The other takeaway is I've actually done some work inside of sensory deprivation chambers or float chambers. And if you want to deal with the bicameral consciousness, go stick yourself in a floaty chamber for 2 hours, and basically it just eliminates all filters and you start hearing things, and it's perfectly natural. You're not schizophrenic. I don't want to go too deep into it, but there are opportunities to learn from a book that is more than 30 years old.
Scott, let me ask you one thing. You've read the book, you've gotten something. What have you gotten? What have you learned from Jaynes?
Initially, I was a philosophy major, and I'll try and make this quick. This is how Julian Jaynes got on my radar. Why were the Greeks, especially like the sword of Damocles? If I displease the god with my rule, God will punish me. Socrates standing in the marketplace and all of a sudden phasing out for a couple days and then coming back with an answer. This was normal for them, but there was a transition period between looking up for all decisions from the gods to all of a sudden the gods are not listening to me. Now I have to make my own decisions, and people march at different paces. Personality types, if you look into personality types, hey, an Enneagram 8 will just go. I mean, you know, but if I believe you're a 2, you're going to crawl, basically. So people are moving at different speeds. So my takeaway was I wrote a really, really good paper back in college. I read a really, really good book, and I'm amazed I remembered all this after 30 years.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate
No, it was
that.
well worth my time. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Alicia. Alicia, what are you walking away with?
Hi, Shrikant. Thank you, everyone. I will keep to my 60 seconds. I also enjoy all of these conversations. Back talking about the cognitive explosion, there were a diverse range of topics and introspections within that area. And this period of time must have required humility of the ego to consider, you know, possible projections of the mind. Even God invited people into their homes, or people invited God into the homes, and the devotees understood the purpose of repentance and heard a movement of voices from a higher perspective. They were examples and archetypes that maybe strove to achieve a sort of Renaissance mind, moving from animal perspective to that of the man. And I thought it was very interesting to hear about how bicameral reactions factor into all of that. And the energy given off that was received was powerful, and behavioral and cognitive, letting go of this unconscious mechanism disparaging the path to a eudaimonia. And I thought that was absolutely amazing, because honestly, it was just such an enlightening conversation. And it is said to have been the most convincing mark of a god, to be able to see from that higher level. And I thought you were absolutely right. It got quite complicated, but you all did a wonderful job at clarifying, and the levels of positions being presented were, you know, articulated in this beautiful manner, almost like poetry. And I will definitely be reading the book to dive deeper. Thank you so much for sharing your kindness and knowledge. I really enjoyed the talk. I appreciate your help.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Appreciate that greatly. Thank you. Next up is Judith, followed by Jorge. Judith.
Yeah, I am left with a question, and also I just wanted to know, so what year, what approximate time period this all happened? You're talking about Greek culture. And the reason I asked too is I'm thinking human migration happened across the globe well before that. So did they consider other, you know, smaller civilizations like the Aborigines that didn't have the force? You said that you said larger civilizations that couldn't handle, you know, small populations could handle hearing voices, but you needed more introspective thinking to handle when you didn't have anyone you could ask. So in some of those populations that would have moved before then, did they do studies on that? How does that factor in? That is the question I'm left with. And I'm very interested in the book as well.
Great. Yeah, so Jaynes, about the origin of language and the timing of language, and all of this depends on language. So we have tribal groups going back earlier than 100,000 years ago, and they would have just been, you know, pre-bicameral and more like a non-human animal in a lot of ways than a modern human. And then as language developed along with it in these, first in these tribal cultures. So roughly around anywhere from 50 to 100,000 years ago. Some people think that language is much older. And then, so we had the pre-bicameral phase, the language and the bicameral mind, the beginnings of civilization around 10,000 BC, and then the transition to modern consciousness beginning, say, 1500 BC up to 800 BC, as these different changes happened over a number of generations.
Thank you. Next up is Jorge Best.
Thank you. I just wanted to share a couple of things. Of course, the not reading the book is so difficult to understand so many things that Julian explained and connected. I read a book many years ago. I got back to it from time to time. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Completely convinced of his theories. And then a few years ago, I found out one relative had, it's not sure if it's complete schizophrenia or definitely hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. I got very interested into trying to get closer to her. And it's amazing that she was completely convinced that this was real voices, as Julian explains, and everybody talks about. It's not like she was just thinking about herself. This was actually multiple voices, critical, usually telling her things to do. At some point she started taking medication, but then she stopped the medication and the voices came back. She's doing much better now. I think she's doing better with the medication, but the reality of the voices impacting her, telling her what to do, criticizing her, is one aspect that, I mean, is exactly as it described by Julian. It's very, very real to the people that are listening to them. So I just wanted to share that. It's really, really convincing once you experience it through a relative.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's do closing thoughts. So let's start with Brian, then Marcel, then me. Brian.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody. Very, I can tell people really taking and thinking deeply about this. And one thing I would say about Julian Jaynes, and this is, I think, been touched upon in the last 2 hours, is that Julian Jaynes was not just talking about psychology. Julian Jaynes is offering us a very different way of viewing the human condition. And you don't really appreciate or understand Jaynes until you understand what he was trying to do, which was to fit together neurology, linguistics, history, religious studies, all these things that most scholars spend a lifetime studying. He was able to not master them all, but to fit them together like a puzzle. And to me, that's what's so convincing and useful about what Jaynes had to say.
Wonderful. I'm going to, but let me actually build on that. See, this is what is unique about, about a great mind. A great mind puts together, they take everything that is known at their time and puts it together in a way which is actually many years ahead of anybody else. And there are many, many people in history, few hundreds at least, who have been able to do that in various fields. And Julian Jaynes is one of them. Now, support for part of his theory, okay? What he's talking about, he's actually integrating, just as Brian said, he's trying to integrate history, evolution, what happens with age, what happens with consciousness, what happens with religion, what are the functions of all of this, how did they change over time? And he's trying to come up with a coherent explanation for it. There are a few things that develop which are truly unique. He has things to say about language, which are very fundamental. There are multiple uses of language. People just say language, it is, I mean, one thing I've learned is that language is a very deep area. Spoken language is very different than written language. Cultures that are used to written language use the language very different from cultures that don't have any spoken language. The range of communication with language varies. It could be language where words are simply used as a supplement to mostly nonverbal communication, to words themselves by being able to do things across the world. So there is this entire realm of language that he opens up. He talks about writing. That's probably one of the greatest things I have gotten from Julian Jaynes. It's partly my conclusions based on what he has written. What writing does is that writing takes something that you are doing inside here and puts it out there. Okay. Once it is out there, you can look at it. It allows you a self-reflection about your thought that you could not do within your mind, no matter how much. It is a way of expanding your mental space, which has had profound impact on civilization, profound impact on individual, what an individual mind can do, let alone the social consequences of it. So these are just few things. The more tougher things to understand is his concept of consciousness. What exactly are you doing when you say you're conscious? What is self-awareness? What do you actually do? How does time come into this? And all these issues he brings together and he plays with them. He shows it to you standing on his shoulders, you know? So those, if you did that with Jaynes, we would be able to do that too. So I would strongly recommend that. Marcel.
Well, first, I just want to say thanks so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed speaking to all of you tonight, and I appreciate the great questions and the very thoughtful questions that people have. And we are really just scratching the surface of this. It's there's so much more to it that we haven't been able to get to. And for people to be engaged and interested based on this very sketch that it really does take reading the book to fully understand, you know, the whole theory. One little other tantalizing thing that we didn't get to that I'll leave you with is there was a comment earlier about introspection during the time of the Iliad and things like that, and that is dreams. And this was something that I think is so fascinating. I think we all have a tendency to think that dreams have been the same throughout history, but in fact, that's not the case. And there's this really fascinating transition. Dreams in the ancient world, which were these visitation dreams, or I call them bicameral dreams. And the earliest recorded dreams have the person sleeping in their bed and being visited by a god or a dead ancestor telling them what to do. So it very much paralleled their waking experience. And as consciousness develops, we see this transition to modern conscious dreams, whilst vicariously doing things in other situations in our imagination. So it turns out that dreams are another way to gauge the conscious development in these ancient cultures. And so if we had the modern mind at that point, 2000 BC, I think it's hard to these transitions that we see in everything from some of the things we talked about before to dreams. And Jaynes talks about the consciousness operating on our emotions, where first you have fear that all animals have, and becomes anxiety. How we can have anger, but with consciousness, it develops into something like hatred. And all of these interesting transitions taking place around this time that just seem to have any other explanation than this late date for this transition. And about mating and how in the animal world, in the early human world, mating was just very mundane and there wasn't much to it. But with consciousness, it brings in all of these other layers of fantasy and this explosion in ancient Greece of things related to this more modern concept of sex. And this is all happen at the same time, and they're all different aspects that that are really interesting to look at and different pieces of the puzzle. So again, I just want to say thanks to everyone. We have a lot more information on the Julian Jaynes Society website. We have a whole area for members with a lot of lectures by Jaynes and other people at conferences we've held, and articles, and a lot of great material there, and a discussion forum that's open to the public where you can post questions and have them answered. And we published a number of books as well that really build on Jaynes's ideas. So once you've read Jaynes's book, there's a lot more material that we've put out, really expand it and develop it into other areas. So thanks again. I really enjoyed